Welcome back to the A to Z of writing language learning materials. This video is G is for goals. We're going to look at the importance of writing your goals or your aims and your objectives before you start writing your materials, or that you have in your head a clear goal and set of objectives that you're trying to achieve with your material. Now, first of all, terminology. Some books call them goals, some call them aims. We're going to call it G is for goals, and we mean aims. And then within goals, you have objectives, which are those kind of sub-goals. You'll see what I mean in a minute, okay? Let's get going. So on the screen, you can see something that's based on the work of Kathleen Graves, and you'll see the reference at the bottom of the screen. It's from her book, Designing Language Courses. And for Graves, she says, when we plan a lesson or we write a set of materials, we want to come up with one clear goal and then three objectives. Why three? Well, in the average lesson of, say, 45 minutes to 90 minutes, three main objectives, 3 or 4 is probably enough for one class. And it gives you something very clear to work with. So first of all, you need to define your goal or aim. So let me give you an example here. The goal is to enable B1 students to tell the story of their company in English. So imagine this is an adult group of learners learning business English perhaps, or English for their work. They're at sort of B1, low intermediate level. They want to tell the story of their company in English so that when they meet somebody and somebody says, "Who do you work for?" rather than just saying the name of the company, they can kind of tell the story of their company and how it began. Now, if that's our overall goal for the material, we can then start to decide on the objectives. Now, there might be more than 3 objectives. There might be 4 or 5 different things we could teach students or put into the material to help them. But realistically, in one lesson or on one worksheet, it's going to be too much. So we need to prioritize maybe 3 or 4 and then say, we'll cover the other ones in a follow-up lesson. Maybe when we're revising the goal in a future lesson, we'll include the other objectives. So for this lesson, I've chosen, first of all, to review past tenses. So my B1 students should be familiar with past simple, regular, irregular verbs. They've probably met past continuous. They'll have used present perfect for past reference. They might not have used past perfect yet. So I have to think about that and whether they actually need past perfect in order to tell the story. Objective 2, they might need discourse markers for storytelling. So the equivalent of once upon a time. They're not going to necessarily say once upon a time, but they might have phrases like 50 years ago, there was a woman who had an idea for a new pizza restaurant, or 10 years later, or after she'd studied at university, and so on. So little phrases, functional phrases to just structure the story into a sort of beginning, middle, and end. And then the third objective is, by the end of the class, I want students to be practicing telling their story. I want them to develop that fluency. Now already, because I've brainstormed those objectives, I can see how the material will take shape. I suspect I'll probably start with a listening at the beginning, which will provide them with a model version of somebody telling the story of their company. I'm going to get them to check their understanding. Then I'm going to do a deep dive into the listening script, identify use of past tenses, use of discourse markers, probably provide some control practice, maybe some gap fill practice, that kind of thing. And then by the end of the class, I want them to actually have started to develop their own stories, get into pairs or groups, and start practicing telling their story. So by defining the goal and the objectives, I'm doing a lot of the heavy lifting right from the outset. And I can, as I'm preparing this, I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I can see what the material needs to do. So that's one pretty safe approach to goals and objectives when you're planning your materials. Let's look at another technique. This is a tip from Zoe Elder. She has a blog called Full On Learning. She's an educator. And I like her "so that" rule for writing objectives. It's very simple. but very effective for making sure that your goals are relevant to your students. And it also helps you think about what the material needs to look like. So, for example, here are 3 objectives: to use the past simple, to listen for keywords and phrases, to learn words connected with transport. Now, we often see those kinds of objectives in course books, but the question is for the materials writer, why are they learning it? Why are they learning the past simple? Are they just learning it for grammatical reasons? Maybe they have to pass an exam. Okay. But why are they listening for keywords and phrases? Or why transport? Elder says, add so that. If you add so that to the objective, you have to explain why they're learning it. So to use the past simple so that students can talk about their last holiday. To listen for keywords and phrases so that students can understand the main points of a lecture and take notes. So that's clearly for an EAP course. Or to learn words connected with transport so that students can compare types of travel, which is the sort of thing they might be asked to do in the speaking part of an exam or in an essay. But the point is, by adding so that, you're forced to explain the relevance. But also, as a materials writer, it helps you think about context. So if the aim of my material is to help students with past simple, I'm suddenly thinking, actually, the topic is holidays. Or if it's listening for keywords or phrase, the context is a lecture. So I'm going to think about what kind of lecture might be useful for this and to develop note-taking skills. Or words connected with transport, maybe I'm going to have pictures of different types of transport and students compare them. Or maybe I have a table of data, about things like the speed of transport or how long it takes to get from A to B in a car versus a bicycle. But by adding the so that, it's driving my thinking towards what will the material look like. So I really recommend you try the so that rule. Here's another technique for developing goals and objectives, the what, who, where test. I use this a lot in speaking lessons where I want students to be doing a speaking task by the end of the lesson. For example, if my goal is to enable students to order a meal, that might be my objective, but it doesn't tell me enough about the context. Is it a formal meal? Is it a meal with a friend? Is it a meal with a colleague? Is it a meal in an expensive restaurant? Is it a meal in a fast food restaurant? There's too many questions that I still have about that objective. So I need to start asking questions like what, who, and where. And that makes me expand the goal, and it will also help me with objectives. So if we ask what, who, where about that goal, we might add information to it. So to enable students to discuss a menu, that answers the what are they going to be talking about. With a friend tells them who is involved in the conversation. And order a meal is also the what. With a waiter, so there's a third person involved in the kind of dialogues they're going to be listening to and having to speak in. And it's in a restaurant. Now, I could even say what type of restaurant there in order to indicate the type of menu and so on. But you'll see, as I start to ask questions, I can develop my goals and objectives, and it helps me with the materials design. So suddenly I'm thinking, okay, I'm going to need a menu in this material. I'm going to need a listening between two friends. A waiter's going to enter the conversation. Or maybe I'm designing video material and I need 3 characters. And then I'm thinking, well, what type of restaurant is it? Is it a high street restaurant? Is it a more formal restaurant? Maybe if it was with a business client, for example. But asking those questions can really help. You can also ask the how question. Well, how is the student talking? So if a student says, I need to give presentations, your first question should be, well, how are you doing it? Are you doing it face-to-face? Are you doing it in a large auditorium? Are you doing it around a small table? Are you doing it online? Because all of those questions connected with how and where will affect the type of language you teach. So the what, who, where test and how test sometimes is a useful kind of questioning tool for goals and objectives. My last tip, backward planning. Often it's helpful to picture what students will do by the end of the class. Picture it like a set of IKEA instructions. If I show you the page of instructions on the screen, it's granular. It's the equivalent of lots of grammar, lots of vocabulary, lots of phonemes, but they don't seem to connect in any way, and students can't see the relevance of why they're doing it. But if we show students what we want them to produce by the end of the material, it suddenly becomes clearer why they're doing these other things. So in this analogy, they see the bookshelf, they know what they're aiming towards, and so they understand all these other bits and that they will eventually interconnect to produce and achieve the final goal. So backward planning and starting at the end of the material can be quite useful. For example, you often see this kind of thing at the end of worksheets or at the end of units. So we're going back to the example I had where we're in the restaurant and we're talking to the friend and the waiter about the menu. We can break that down and say, by the end of the class, I need students to have read and understood the menu, asked my friend and the waiter about some of the dishes, ordered the meal, and maybe asked the bill and paid for it. There's different ways we could show what we want students to do by the end. The point is that by defining this for the end, first of all, you create a sort of little can you checklist so that students can tick what they think they did well after they practice this conversation in class and what they need to work on. But it also allows you to work backwards. So for example, your opening goal based on what you want them to do at the end would be, by the end of the worksheet that I'm writing, students will be able to read and discuss a menu with a friend and order a meal from a waiter in a restaurant. So you picture what will be the final activities in your worksheet, and then you work backwards. And there you have the mini objectives and what grammar, or in this context, what phrases you're going to use. You're going to need a menu on the page. You're going to need a listening and so on. But that thinking backwards is a helpful way to visualize what the material is going to look like. So those are just some tips on ways of planning and developing your goals and objectives. Before we finish, let's take a quick look about how this might transfer itself into your materials. Now, for this, I'm taking some example pages from my book, Life 3rd edition, pre-intermediate, just to show you how we feed goals and objectives into the actual design of the material. And it's something you can steal and use in your own worksheet design, for example, or your own materials. So what you can see on the screen there is an opener page from a unit, and notice how in the bottom left we have flagged the unit goals, and this is quite popular in Coursebook now. It's like a little menu of what you're going to see in the unit, and it's kind of all the goals for each page or spread of the unit, and then you list them like that, and it makes it very clear to the teacher and to the student what's going to be in each lesson. And sometimes on your worksheets, you could maybe include the goal or the objective somewhere in the design. One way to do this, and I'm showing you another spread from the course book, is to use the kind of goals as like subheadings. Now, it can vary on the approach to this. For example, I can have a subheading like reading, and I could actually, if I wanted to, I could put like skimming or scanning, and you might see that in some course books. I've got a vocabulary, or what we call a word building section, where I'm going to focus on verb plus preposition. So this is another objective from this lesson. Notice it's not the full objective, it's just little short keywords, but it tells the teacher and also the student where we're going. You can see the grammar. We're going to deal with reported speech, and there's going to be some speaking at the end as well. Now, you might say they're not altogether clear as objectives, because, okay, I've said reading, I've said speaking, but I haven't said what they're going to be doing. So along the top, we include a more extended menu where you can say reading, they're going to be reading a timeline, speaking, they're going to be talking about video games and games, basically. So within the design of the material, you've got this little menu effect going on of the goals and objectives. It doesn't need to take up much room, and it also breaks the material up a bit and makes it look less dense on the page. So something to consider. Then at the end of the unit, this is just to go back to the idea of backward planning. Notice on the review page of the unit, there's a list of I can statements. These I can statements, or can you statements, you can word them as questions if you like. Students review at the end of the unit what they feel confident with. Now you can put these at the end of a single lesson on the worksheet. It could be maybe the objectives just at the end of the worksheet, and students evaluate whether they can do them. But notice in this unit 1 how the I can statements basically copy what the unit goals were that I showed you from the beginning of the unit. And in that way, we're recycling the goals and the objectives, and students are being reminded of what the purpose and the aim of the material was. I hope that's given you some ideas and tips on writing materials. G is for goals. So you can write the overview goal, and then you can select maybe 3 objectives, maybe 4 objectives, depends on the length of the material. You can use so that to ensure there's some relevance. You can do some the who, what, where test, ask questions about the goals and extend the length of the goal so it gives you more information, and then it starts to suggest what's going to be in the material. You can do backward planning, and you can also integrate goals and objectives into the actual design of the material and break the material up, and also use things like can-do statements and goals at the beginning as a way for students to evaluate their own performance. Have they really acquired and achieved the goals and objectives that you set out? Why not try it in your own material? See what works for you.